Senate Joint Resolution 467 by Senator Norris.
Senator Norris, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move adoption of Senate Joint Resolution 467.
Senator Norris moves adoption of Senate Joint Resolution 467 on third and final consideration. That's seconded. There are no amendments. Senator Norris, you're recognized for explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to say at the outset here, I know committees are scheduled at 2:30, but I know we had a lot of visitors in the gallery today who'd come to hear this. I'm told that ample time's been scheduled for the committees that are meeting, given what's on their agenda. So thank you for letting me continue. Otherwise, we'd have wrapped it up and come back, I guess, on Wednesday. Mr. Speaker, simply put, Senate Joint Resolution 467 is the resolution seeking declaratory relief to authorize the Attorney General or other counsel to obtain declaratory relief of the state's rights and therefore the people of Tennessee's rights under the Refugee Act of 1980 in two particulars. One, the federal government's failure to consult, as required by the Refugee Act of 1980, regarding the placement of refugees in the state at this time. And secondly, the continued expenditure of funds under the Act without specific appropriation by the General Assembly, as required by Article 2, Section 24 of the Tennessee Constitution. Both of these instances place us in the precarious position of being threatened with litigation on the one hand for not upholding these constitutional rights and being criticized by others for seemingly being hard-hearted and otherwise insensitive on the other hand. As I said in committee, to me, these rights are not mutually exclusive. I know there are folks here in the gallery today arguing the rights of immigrants and refugees. I'm arguing the rights of citizens and sovereignty in Tennessee. As I said in committee, the two are not mutually exclusive. There is an overlap. I'm reminded of Groucho Marx. He used to talk about what kind of club would want him as a member. He said he wouldn't want to be the member of any club that would accept him as a member. And I think about our rights under our state and federal constitutions here. You know, we stand to uphold individuals' rights under these constitutions, and I wouldn't think anybody would want to come to Tennessee unless we were the kind of state that did defend those rights, particularly where some of these folks have probably come from, where they didn't have any rights like those we rise to enforce today. That's the sum and substance of the resolution. I will yield to any questions.
Senator Norris renewed his motion for adoption. We're on the resolution. Senator Green, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A question for the sponsor.
He yields.
Mr. Speaker, for the sponsor, just a question. Does anywhere in this resolution say that Tennessee is opposed to refugees coming to Tennessee?
Senator Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, sir, it does not. It simply says that these things should not be done without the Tennessee General Assembly's approval.
Further discussion. Senator Yarbrough.
Will sponsor yield?
Yields.
Does this body have the authority to direct the Attorney General to bring a lawsuit?
Senator Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't have the authority to direct, although the D word is used. It is also clear in the resolution that the Attorney General has within its discretion the opportunity to decline, in which case we would retain outside counsel. So as we discussed in committee, it's precatory and not mandatory.
Senator Yarbrough.
And would the client there be the Tennessee legislature? Is that what you're proposing?
Senator Norris.
Or the state of Tennessee?
It would be the state of Tennessee through the General Assembly.
Senator Yarbrough.
What do we hope to achieve in this lawsuit?
Senator Norris.
We hope to obtain a declaration of our rights under the Declaratory Judgments Act, 28 U.S.C. 2201 et sec, to clarify how it is in the second instance that we can be expending state funds without appropriations in our annual budget, the budget that I have to carry, the budget that I have to sponsor. We are told, and upon that telling, I believe that we are expending funds for a program from which Governor Bredesen withdrew in 2007. And therefore, it appears to us that the federal government is trying to do indirectly what it cannot do directly. It cannot force us to appropriate funds without our knowing approval.
Senator Yarbrough?
I forget the exact acronym of what the refugee program allows once a state has withdrawn, but that was a statutory case when Tennessee withdrew from the program. So when Tennessee's legislature made the decision to withdraw, or when the Tennessee government made the decision to withdraw, we knew that these appropriations were going to be made through this alternative. Is that not correct?
Senator Norris?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do not believe that is correct. I think at the time that Governor Bredesen withdrew the state, that the expenditures at that time were covered 100% by the federal government. Under the Wilson-Fish Amendment to the Refugee Act of 1980, states had the right to withdraw. The federal government had the right to step into their shoes through a voluntary agency. That's the acronym, the VOLAG. But at that time, those expenditures were being picked up to the tune of 100%. Through what some refer to as cost shifting, that's no longer the case. And what they've done now is shift those costs to us without specific appropriations by us.
Yarbrough?
When did that shift occur?
Senator Norris?
It's my understanding that the shift has occurred over time. I think that it has been accelerated perhaps since about 2010.
Senator Yarbrough?
What prompts this resolution right now?
Senator Norris?
Two things, as I say. One, which brings it most dramatically to our attention, is, as testified to by our Commissioner of Safety and Homeland Security, the federal government's refusal to consult with us concerning our present situation. We had testimony in a joint Government Operations Committee on or about December 7th of 2015, after hearing the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation testify that there is inadequate vetting of refugees who are slated to be resettled in this country. The committee hearing had a number of folks testify, including Commissioner Gibbons, who testified rather dramatically at the time that he had been unable to get the federal government to respond to the state of Tennessee's inquiries about the program and the vetting process. We also had at that time, at my invitation, David Shedd, who came here to testify in person that there was inadequate vetting under the system that is in place, a system which he created. As the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he gave us very compelling testimony about the shortcomings in the system and the process at play. Now, I have stayed in communication with Commissioner Gibbons since that time, and as of last week when this was heard in Finance, he reconfirmed that there has still been no consultation with the state of Tennessee concerning the status of that program.
Senator Yarbrough?
Didn't Governor Haslam state just last week that the federal government is providing us appropriate information on refugees?
Senator Norris?
I don't know what Governor Haslam said, but I know what testimony has been in committee, and it is as I have stated it.
Senator Yarbrough?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just think that this is, at the very least, if we want to look at the particulars of what's going on in the refugee program, I think there are lots of opportunities to do that. I think that passing this resolution to become one of a handful of states that are suing the federal government over the refugee program is misguided and really betrays the values of who we are. And we would be joining Alabama and Texas bringing a case that has very little merit to it. And I think this is one that is jumping on the bandwagon of something that's doesn't represent what is best about Tennessee. Thank you.
Senator Stevens?
There it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution just because as the gentleman from Davidson comments of who we are. I hear that statement made a lot, Mr. Speaker, and who we are is a nation of laws. We are not a nation of men. We are a nation of a Constitution, Mr. Speaker. And under our Constitution, we have separation of powers, and this General Assembly is empowered to spend the taxpayers' dollars. I rise in support of this because we need to know, has the federal government intruded upon their spending authority and telling us how we need to spend our dollars? There is case law cited in the Sebelius decision that talks about, in particular, Mr. Speaker, where the federal government entices a state to enter into a contractual arrangement on its spending and then changes the rules after the fact. The Stewart machine case in particular is what comes to mind. And in that case, the Supreme Court found that there was not an infringement by the federal government, that the restriction or the spending was an encouragement to the states. But there are other cases, for example, the Sebelius case, where the Supreme Court found that the federal government moved beyond encouraging the state to act, but coercing the state to act. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, there is no bright line test to tell when the federal government has exceeded its authority. And under that, I feel it's important that we do protect the taxpayers of the state of Tennessee as we're sworn to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Overby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With regard to the first point raised by the gentleman from Davidson County, when I first read this Senate Joint Resolution 467, I too was concerned about the directory language and had discussions with Leader Norris about that language weeks before this bill was put on notice and heard in the Finance, Ways, and Means Committee. I think there is a line which this General Assembly cannot cross with giving due deference to the doctrine of the separation of powers between the legislative branch and the judicial branch of government, which is where under our state constitution, the Attorney General's office lies. It was, I think, important testimony in the Finance, Ways, and Means Committee when the Associate Attorney General gave testimony and pointed out a couple of things that I think is important that leads us to conclude that we are, should this resolution pass, we are on the correct side of that line. And he pointed out, one, that this is a resolution, not a bill. So it is a resolving that this chamber, together then, if the House concurs, goes on record favoring a declaratory judgment be brought, versus a bill that would actually put into law the Attorney General must do thus and so. And so the Associate Attorney General said that office considered this more as a urging or a request than to be a directory. Secondly, as the Majority Leader points out, there are provisions in this resolution that says if the Attorney General decides not to bring an action, then something else will happen. So I rise just to make that point because I share the concern about one branch of government overstepping or directing another branch, which I think we cannot do, but wanted to give to this body the sense of what was said. The other part of this resolution, as far as the substantive, is the part about collaboration. And I think the word is in the resolution, and consultation. And if federalism is to be effective, it has to go both ways, not only from the federal government down, but from the states back. And it is important on an issue like this that there be collaboration so that the proper things can be done and everyone's duties met to refugees coming into this country, for which I think we all feel a great empathy for anyone that flees persecution flees a government where they have no rights. I think we all have great empathy for those folks who come here under the protection of this great country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Kelsey, Senator Yeager, and Senator Harris. Senator Kelsey?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution as well on the point of who we are as a state. We are the volunteer state, but we are not the volunteered state. And we have many volunteers in this state who have done great work helping out refugees who have come into this state. But the federal government cannot simply tell us that we're going to have to spend our taxpayer dollars on folks that they are sending to us through a program that is against our will.
Yeager?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the bill, and I appreciate the work that the leader has done to bring this resolution to us today. I've had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to discuss this issue with him, and I really appreciate his even-handed approach as he's tried to bring a resolution to this issue. And frankly, having heard the testimony in the State and Local Government Committee, the refusal, and from that testimony, the refusal of the federal government to provide the information that as legislators we need to know as we try to protect Tennessee taxpayers' interest, really leave us no choice into bringing this matter to courts. In other words, to make sure that we have the relief from federal government's mandated appropriations and that we protect Tennessee taxpayers. It is not, Mr. Speaker, an anti-refugee bill. To the contrary, I don't know a more compassionate man than the leader. But we're just trying to get information that the federal government has failed to provide at risk to Tennessee taxpayers, and I'm happy to support the bill.
Harris?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the sponsor will yield.
Yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the sponsor from Shelby County because I know that he's got constituents and he's heard from Tennesseans that have a sincere desire to stay safe, and I think that probably inspires this bill. But there are other Tennesseans that I've heard from, and many of you have heard from, and that are out in the hall and in the gallery today that also speak for their respective communities, and they'd like to protect the vulnerable. They'd like to keep people safe, and they'd like to be welcoming and inviting and tolerant. And they'd like for us to have a fair reputation worldwide as a welcoming volunteer state. And so I rise in opposition to the bill because they are opposed to it. I think that the other problem with this bill is that we may very well be injecting politics into the decision of the AG. And that is a worrisome trend, is that the AG is an independent authority, and we should leave it that way. And we should not unnecessarily second guess and intervene in how the AG undertakes his deliberations and decides which task to undertake, unless we think the AG is not aware of this issue. That would be a different matter altogether. But I am quite confident that the AG is aware. He's aware of his responsibility to make sure that there's no unnecessary federal encroachment upon Tennessee, and he's aware of how to do his job. And all this does today is this creates the specter that politics will become part of the process. So I would suggest we stay out of it. I know that we have constituents on both sides of the issue. I've certainly got many who want to be welcoming and inviting, and I'm sure there are others who have fair safety concerns. But I think we should probably stay out of this one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, sir.
Green?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, want to rise in support of this resolution, and I thank very much the leader for putting this together so eloquently. This doesn't stop Tennessee taking refugees. It's not a statement against refugees. We in Tennessee have a heart to take care of those people, as many of us have said, and there are many of us who've actually gone overseas to volunteer our services in very difficult and distant lands. However, our federal government has quite frankly failed to protect us. It's very clear, evidence has shown that in certain groups of these refugees, people who want to do harm to us are infiltrating this program. And the federal government has failed to give us any assurances, and it's very clear that open source information reveals that you can't verify in particular countries, essentially Syria, for example, that the people who say they are John Doe are really John Doe. The federal government has owned that they can't do it, and yet they insist on bringing large numbers of those individuals to the United States, and they want to put them in Tennessee. We have a primary responsibility to protect the people that are here. And so, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this, and again, thank the sponsor for his bringing this resolution.
Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it is a shame that we've had to bring this to the Senate floor as we have. I support the bill, but I guess having to do it in this way could present that I guess false perspective that we're not a welcoming state, which is quite the contrary. I think everyone in here is from immigrant background. I know I've got Scotch-Irish. My great-great-granddad was one half American Indian, but my people came over the mountains, and I think the old saying was the Germans that came to northeast Tennessee were welcomed because they knew how to create industry and build plants like North America Rayon and Bonnet and Elizabethton. But at the same time, the Scotch and the Irish came over and they knew how to fight the Indians, and so they were loved by the Germans. We've got that background. But I support this bill from a common sense perspective. It's just good common sense, as Senator Green said, that we want to welcome people, but we want to know who they are, where they've come from, where they're being placed in our state, by whom, and that they've been vetted as thoroughly as possible. And as we all know, the vetting process is not an easy one in this case because we don't have adequate records. But we need to feel comfortable that we're the ones doing that. And so I think, we can approach this from a common sense perspective, which is really, I think, what Senator Norris is trying to do.
Beavers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution. I called the Lieutenant Governor early on when I heard about the Thomas More Center, that they would represent us, and he immediately got Senator Norris doing a lot of research, working with the Thomas More Center, and we've come to this day. As legislators, it's our job to protect Tennesseans. It's our job to protect taxpayers' money. That's why this makes sense. We had testimony in committee this summer that there's been no consultation with the federal government. They have not told us anything. They don't know who is being sent in here under the Refugee Resettlement Program. They are not being vetted, we've learned, with the federal government, and it's our job, ladies and gentlemen, to protect Tennesseans and protect taxpayers' funds, and we need to vote for this resolution.
Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I call for the question.
Without objection, the question is put. Senator Norris, you may close on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much, members, for your support. What could be more welcoming than a state that is willing to stand upon its rights under the state and the federal Constitution to protect the people within its borders? What, I ask you, could possibly be more welcoming than that? Or on the contrary, would you feel welcome in a state that did not stand on its rights to defend your rights, to defend the peace, safety, and happiness of the people of this state? Nonsense. You come here, more likely than not, because you flee those places where you had no such rights. Would you feel welcome in a state that had those rights but didn't rise to enforce them? Of course not. That's what we're doing here today, ladies and gentlemen. And I think to do anything less would demonstrate a deliberate indifference to our duty to defend the peace, safety, and happiness of this place. I appreciate your support.
Parliamentary situation. The question has been put. Senator Norris has closed, so we're on the board. So those in favor vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Every member voted. Mr. Clerk, take a vote.
Ayes 27, 5 nays.
SGR 467, Henry City Constitution majority hereby declared adopted. Without objection, motion to reconsider goes to table. Senator Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, thank you all for your indulgence in that important matter. If we could now